My name is Marlee Liss. I'm going to be sharing about my own personal story of experiencing sexual violence and then fighting for a restorative justice outcome. I was 21 years old when this happened. A bunch of things happened in the world that kind of led me to sort of randomly at the time be working on this women's meditation center. I actually came home from that experience being really committed to challenging violence in the world, supporting women, non-binary folk. After I got home from that meditation center, I made plans to go out with my friends. We were drinking and we went to this club, and I had plans to sleep at my friend's place afterwards. Slowly, one by one, we kind of lost each other throughout the night. So one of the friends, the one I had plans to sleep at, she ended up getting really sick, like from drinking too much, and decided to go home early. She was like, stay out, have fun. And as I lost my friends one by one, I'm sort of looking around for them. And that's when this man that I don't know at all comes up to me and he's like, oh, are you looking for someone? I can help. And he starts helping me look for my friend, not having any luck. I call her, not having any luck. And I say, like, I'm really drunk, I'm really tired, I'm just gonna head back to my friend's place. And he says, okay, I'll help you get a cab. So he walks me out to the front of the club. A cab pulls up, rolls down the window and says, where are you going? I say the name of the building and he's like, oh my gosh, that's so weird. That's where I live as well. And he actually did. At that point, we're like, okay, makes sense to just split the cab then and go to the building. And so we get there and I realize that I don't know my friend's unit number. So I'm calling her. She's not answering. And at this point, I'm really drunk, really exhausted. And he's like, you know what? If you need a place to lie down, you're welcome to be in my unit for a bit as you keep calling your friend. So I went up with him, and at first he was very kind and courteous, got me water, left the room. And then about a minute later, he came back and just completely changed his tune. He pulled down my pants and started to assault me. And I thought about all the times I've learned about this kind of thing, and I mustered up the capacity to say, no out loud, I don't want this. And I had this moment of realizing that that wasn't working. My voice didn't have any power in the situation. And so at that point, my body just kind of froze, and he proceeded to assault me for 4 hours. After he finished on me, he left the room for a second, and I realized that the sun was rising, that it was the next day. And something about that made me snap back into my body, grab my stuff, and just run out of the room. After that, I went back to my place and I stood outside my roommate's door for a while. And so I did muster up the courage to knock, and I told her what happened, and she was wonderful. She believed me. She didn't do any of that victim blaming, what were you wearing, how much did you drink stuff. She just met me with support and care. We went to a hospital to do a rape kit. The first one we went to, the nurses were understaffed. They already had too many requests for rape kits that morning, which is heartbreaking to think about. And so we actually had to go to a different hospital to try again. And the second one we went to, they were able to see me and to do the rape kit. And they asked me what happened. And I just kind of handed that piece of paper because I had written down the details, and went through this process, taking pictures of the bruises, scratches that I had, doing DNA tests. They had to do an internal exam, which was of course really triggering in that moment. And when the exam was finished, the nurse turned to me and said, okay, you have two options now. You can either go home, or I can call the police and you can report this. And at this time, I didn't know that restorative justice existed. I had never even heard of it. So in my head, it sounded like the two options were something or nothing at all. And my sole motivation for reporting was that I didn't want nothing at all. And I also couldn't fathom going home and just proceeding with normalcy. So I told her, sure, I'll report right away. I felt like the process was so cold. I later learned that police are not allowed to show too much compassion in those moments because it would imply that they believe you, which would imply a bias. And when I left the police station that day, I felt like my whole focus became surviving. My whole mind, body, everything was focused on healing, like getting through this time. I eventually got to a place where I was so low that I was considering taking my life, and I really was just trying to get by each day. And because I was so focused on that, I didn't really have much capacity at all to think about the justice process that was happening at the same time. 2 whole years went by before I really got any updates from the court process, from the punitive process. At that point, I was called to a preliminary trial, which is where they try to determine, is there enough evidence to go to the big full-out trial? So it's kind of like a mini court process. I went in to the trial feeling really, really afraid. Everything I'd been coached on leading up to the trial made me really nervous. So I had access to 1 free hour of legal support to help advise me in the courtroom as a survivor. And I was told that if I didn't answer a question on the stand, I could be charged as non-cooperative. That was so terrifying to me because obviously I didn't want to be charged as non-cooperative, but B, I also felt at the time like I didn't have the capacity to respond to really triggering questions. I was really scared that I couldn't do it. When I was on the stand, I felt like I was on trial. There was so much victim blaming, sexual shaming, bringing up my history as proof that I wanted this. I was told to wear a gray turtleneck, to tie my hair back, no makeup in order to be deemed more credible. I was told to be emotional, but not too emotional, but not too stoic. So the whole thing felt very like we were in an acting class and I'm not an actor. I was like, what is this? It feels so inauthentic. When I left the courtroom that day, I was like, screw that process. That sucked so much. I felt like every step I'd taken in my healing, I'd been knocked way back right to where I was right after trauma. And so again, my whole focus became survival. I had to put any thoughts about the justice process on the back burner in order to get through that time. And so another year went by. So now it'd been 3 years total since I'd experienced the rape, and I was subpoenaed for the criminal trial. So they had decided that there was enough evidence to go forward. And my very first thought when I got the subpoena was, I'm going to drop the charges. I don't want to do this. And so I told my friend that that's what I wanted to do. My friend was like, clearly this option doesn't feel good for you to drop the charges. And she was like, in your dream world, if anything was possible, what would justice look like to you? I think that's one of the most important questions that people should ask survivors, because it gives us that sense of agency back in so many ways. And no one had ever asked me that. At that point, I said, in my dream world, we'd talk about this like human beings rather than people who've been handed scripts and essentially costumes to wear in a courtroom. We'd be authentic. I'd be able to be real about my emotions and the very serious impact that this had on me. I'd be able to ask the questions that had been keeping me up at night for years. I'd hear an apology. My assailant would actually change. He'd go through some kind of therapy or transformative process to make sure that he never does this again. And my friend is very fiery and she just looked at me and she said, so make it happen. And so at that point, I started doing research, Googling. I Googled restorative justice, and I was so amazed that all the needs I'd named, everything I wanted after trauma, had a name for it. I was like, wow, this has been happening for hundreds of years outside the courtroom in Indigenous, Jewish, Mennonite communities. They've been doing this. I'm not alone in these wants. I'm not naive or weak or weird for having these wants that don't line up with the punitive vision of justice we always see. And so I was very grateful for that. And then I was also frustrated because I was like, wow, I've been going through this process for 3 years. I've talked to nurses, advocates, therapists, lawyers, rape crisis centers, other survivors. No one has ever mentioned restorative justice. Not knowing anything much about it at the time, I pulled out my Instagram and make a little story with a question box that was like, does anyone know anything about restorative justice? And then someone responded saying, I do. I have a friend who knows this friend who worked with a lawyer who's an advocate for restorative justice. And that's how I got connected with Karen, who's an amazing lawyer and an advocate for restorative justice. So then we met up with the prosecutors, and there was 2 of them in the room that day. All they knew was that I didn't want to go to criminal trial. They didn't know that I wanted something else. So we went into the room, and one of the prosecutors, I'll call her Cup, and the other one's so Cup was like, right away she said, hey Marlee, like, I hear that you don't want to go to criminal trial, but I also hear that you're a really strong girl. Don't you think that you're a strong girl? And I was like, yeah, I do. And she said, okay, great. So we can do the trial. And started to get up like as if that was the conversation. So just so coercive and like set on criminal trial as the only option. And kind of said, hold on, actually, we want to ask for something else. And that's when I said, I want to do a restorative justice process. I want my assailant to go to therapy, and I want us to eventually meet in a circle process. So was down and Cup was not. And we left the room that day, and the 2 of them were sort of battling it out for the case. And 2 months went by where I didn't know what would happen. Either would get the case and we'd have a restorative justice process, or Cup would get the case and I would drop the charges. So essentially, Cup was actually fighting for nothing. And I think that that's the case so much of the time, that people think they're fighting for justice. But if we look at something like the sexual assault attrition pyramid, which is like Statistics Canada, we see that only 0.03% of rapists are incarcerated through the punitive justice system. So 99.07% of the time, we're actually fighting for nothing at all in terms of accountability. Restorative justice is a process or an approach to justice that prioritizes repair and healing instead of punishment. So instead of looking at what laws have been broken, it looks at what humans have been hurt. My assailant started therapy right away. In his therapy sessions, of course, I don't know all the details of what they talked about because confidentiality, but we would kind of hear about the themes they were looking at. So he was really unpacking everything in our culture that could be complicit in the harm that he caused. So what things within a rape culture lead someone to justify this degree of violence? And he was unpacking all of that. So toxic masculinity, consent and communication skills, unpacking misogyny, patriarchy, why he felt entitled to women's bodies, objectification culture, all of these different things. And so that was so deeply meaningful to me and actually really empowering to know that he was doing that work. And so he did that for about 7 months, and then they decided, it's time, let's meet in this circle. And one sort of prerequisite of the circle was that he had to take full accountability before the circle. So they didn't just throw us into a room together, cross their fingers and hope that it worked out well. There was like actually a lot of prep work, right? So him doing therapy, him taking accountability. Everyone who was in the circle, we met one-to-one with the mediators beforehand to talk about our fears so that they could safeguard for triggers, our most desired outcomes. So really dreaming big, like in an ideal world, how would you feel walking out of this room? It was a really deeply trauma-informed process. Like you can hear as I talk about it, how much care went into making it a truly safe and healing space. So my mom was in the circle, my sister was in the circle, and who were there not as a prosecutor and a lawyer, but as two human beings who were now connected to this story, this case. My assailant was in the circle, of course, and his best friend was there. And that was also to help deepen a sense of accountability. So he couldn't just show up for the circle, walk out of the room and forget it. Like, his best friend was there as well, hearing all of the details, helping to hold him accountable. And then there were two mediators in the room. And we sat down and they asked us really just one question, which was, what brought you here today? And we went around the circle answering that question for a full 8 hours. And a lot of people will say, oh my God, like that sounds horrible. But I'm actually really grateful for it, because in a capitalist courtroom context, we're on a schedule, we don't have time, we're rushing through things. Whereas this was so humane, and they said it takes as long as it takes. And that's how long we needed it to be. It felt so powerful to sit there together. And he did talk about how much work he'd done in therapy, and since that time to take full accountability and to really like take a good hard look in the mirror essentially and face what he'd done. And he did look me in the eyes and say, I'm sorry I sexually assaulted you, and there's nothing I can do to take it back, but I really hope that being here today can help. That was so huge for me. I really felt like I let go of like a 300-pound weight in that moment, and I just started bawling. Like, it was so visceral. It felt like a knot untied in my stomach that I didn't even know was there, and I was just bawling like relief. He did at one point say, like, this has been so life-changing, and I do want to play a role in helping to stop sexual violence. And that in and of itself was so meaningful. I think all the time we see stories where victims turn to survivors, and then we turn to advocates, and the trauma we went through and our healing process is like a catalyst for that journey. And I really do think that the same thing can be true for people who cause harm. Like, the harm that they cause can be, if they go through that deep accountability, a catalyst for them to become advocates and to help break cycles of harm. And there are some beautiful stories out there like that, especially if we look in the restorative and transformative justice movements. This was the first time that a sexual assault case ended with restorative justice in North America through the courts. And so about 2 months after the circle, we had met with all these different media outlets and journalists, and it ended up being that 6 articles came out about my story on the same day. When all those articles came out, I started receiving thousands of messages from survivors all over the world, literally from Australia to South America to like Vietnam, like all over the world. And so many of them were saying, I wish I knew about this. Since then, I've been able to become like a full-time speaker, sharing with people that I never thought I'd share with. Like, the US military reached out to me, like judges in courtrooms, lawyers, police chiefs, Title IX offices, on campuses, like going to conferences all over the world on trauma and recovery and healing. And I just think that it's a story that is so much bigger than myself, because it represents so many different things in terms of like the way that we've been taught to see justice, but also our relationship to recognizing humanity, our levels of care for survivors, and how we've been taught to fail survivors a lot of the time. Like, there's so much around this that feels, again, so much bigger than myself. I think even the possibility of transformation, I think we've really been taught to believe that people do not change and to give up on people very quickly, whereas this story kind of demonstrates that no one is disposable and that transformation is often possible. So it's been such an honor to share this story all over the world and to see people like resonate with those messages in so many different ways. If people want to connect with me, they're very welcome to, and I'm always very happy to resource share. I'm always tempted to name like 10 different books and podcasts podcasts and documentaries that people should watch if they want to learn more. There will be a documentary coming out about my story soon, which is very exciting. So if folks want to stay up to date on that, like, they're very welcome to reach out. And my platforms are just my name. So Marlee Liss, marleeliss.com. And like I said, I'm always really happy to resource share, to answer questions, and to help get this message out into the world.